Chapter 4. Thomas leaned against the tree as he waited for Chuck. He scanned the compound of the Glade, this new place of nightmares where he seemed destined to live. The shadows from the walls had lengthened considerably, already creeping up the sides of the ivy-covered stone faces on the other side. At least this helped Thomas know directions. The wooden building crouched in the northwest corner, wedged in a darkening patch of shadow, the grove of trees in the southwest. The farm area, where a few workers were still picking their way through the fields, spread across the entire northeast quarter of the Glade. The animals were in the southeast corner, mooing and crowing and baying. The exact middle of the courtyard, the still gaping hole of the box lay open, as if inviting him to jump back in and go home. Near that, maybe 20 feet to the south, stood a squat building made of rough concrete blocks, a menacing iron door, its only entrance. There were no windows. A large round handle resembling a steering wheel marked the only way to open the door, just like something within a submarine. Despite what he'd just seen, Thomas didn't know which he felt more strongly, curiosity to know what was inside, or dread at finding out. Thomas had just moved his attention to the 4 vast openings in the middle of the main walls of the Glade when Chuck arrived, a couple of sandwiches cradled in his arms, along with apples and 2 metal cups of water. The sense of relief that flooded through Thomas surprised him. He wasn't completely alone in this place. Frypan wasn't too happy about me invading his kitchen before supper time, Chuck said, sitting down next to the tree, motioning to Thomas to do the same. He did, grabbed the sandwich, but hesitated, the writhing, monstrous image of what he'd seen in the shack popping back into his mind. Soon, though, his hunger won out, and he took a huge bite. The wonderful taste of ham and cheese and mayonnaise filled his mouth. "Oh, man," Thomas mumbled through a mouthful. "I was starving." "Told you," Chuck chomped through into his own sandwich. After another couple of bites, Thomas finally asked the question that had been bothering him. "What's actually wrong with that Ben guy? He doesn't even look human anymore." Chuck glanced over at the house. "Don't really know," he muttered absently. "I didn't see him." Thomas could tell the boy was being less than honest, but decided not to press him. "Well, you don't want to see him, trust me." He continued to eat, munching on the apples as he studied the huge breaks in the walls. Though it was hard to make out from where he sat, there was something odd about the stone edges of the exits to the outside corridors. He felt an uncomfortable sense of vertigo looking at the towering walls as if he hovered above them instead of sitting at their base. "What's out there?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. "Is this part of a huge castle or something?" Chuck hesitated, looked uncomfortable. I've never been outside the Glade." Thomas paused. "You're hiding something," he finally replied, finishing off the last bite and taking a long swig of water. The frustration at getting no answers from anyone was starting to grind his nerves. It only made it worse to think that even if he did get answers, he wouldn't know if he'd be getting the truth. "Why are you guys so secretive?" "That's just the way it is. Things are really weird around here, and most of us don't know everything. Half of everything." It bothered Thomas that Chuck didn't seem to care about what he just said, that he seemed indifferent to having his life taken away from him. What was wrong with these people? Thomas got to his feet and started walking toward the eastern opening. Well, no one said I couldn't look around. He needed to learn something, or he was going to lose his mind. Wait, Chuck cried, running to catch up. "Be careful. Those puppies are about to close." He already sounded out of breath. "Close?" Thomas repeated. "What are you talking about?" "The doors, you shank." "Doors? I don't see any doors." Thomas knew Chuck wasn't just making stuff up. He knew he was missing something obvious. He grew uneasy and realized he'd slowed his pace, not so eager to reach the walls anymore. "What do you call those big openings?" Chuck pointed up at the enormously tall gaps in the walls. They were only 30 feet away now. "I'd call them big openings," Thomas said, trying to counter his discomfort with sarcasm and disappointed that it wasn't working. "Well, they're doors, and they close up every night." Thomas stopped, thinking Chuck had to have said something wrong. He looked up, looked side to side, examined the massive slabs of stone as the uneasy feeling blossomed into outright dread. "What do you mean, they close?" "Just see for yourself in a minute. The runners will be back soon. Then those big walls are going to move until the gaps are closed." "You're jacked in the head," Thomas muttered. He couldn't see how the mammoth walls could possibly be mobile. felt so sure of it he relaxed, thinking Chuck was just playing a trick on him. They reached the huge split that led outside to more stone pathways. Thomas gaped, his mind emptying of thought as he saw it all firsthand. "This is called the East Door," Chuck said, as if proudly revealing a piece of art he'd created. Thomas barely heard him, shocked by how much bigger it was up close. At least 20 feet across, the break in the wall went all the way to the top, far above. The edges that bordered the vast opening were smooth, except for one odd repeating pattern on both sides. On the left side of the east door, deep holes several inches in diameter and spaced a foot apart were bored into the rock, beginning near the ground and continuing all the way up. On the right side of the door, foot-long rods jutted out from the wall edge, also several inches in diameter, in the same pattern as the holes facing them on the other side. The purpose was obvious. "Are you kidding?" Thomas asked, the dread slamming back into his gut. "You weren't playing with me? The walls really move?" What else would I have meant? Thomas had a hard time wrapping his mind around the possibility. "I don't know. I figured there was a door that swung shut or a little mini-wall that slid out of the big one. How could these walls move? They're huge, and they look like they've been standing here for 1,000 years. And the idea of those walls closing and trapping him inside this place they called the Glade was downright terrifying. Chuck threw his arms up, clearly frustrated. "I don't know. They just move. Makes one heck of a grinding noise. Same thing happens out in the maze. These walls shift every night, too." Thomas, his attention suddenly snapped up by a new detail, turned his face to the younger boy. "What did you just say?" "Huh? You just called it a maze. You said, same thing happens out in the maze." Chuck's face reddened. "I'm done with you. I'm done." He walked back toward the tree they'd just left. Thomas ignored him, more interested than ever in the outside of the glade. A maze? In front of him, through the east door, he could make out passages leading to the left, to the right, and straight ahead, and the walls of the corridors were similar to those that surrounded the glade, the ground made of the same massive stone blocks as in the courtyard. The ivy seemed even thicker out there. In the distance, more breaks in the walls led to other paths, and farther down, maybe 100 or so yards away, the straight passage came to a dead end. "Looks like a maze," Thomas whispered, almost laughing to himself, as if things couldn't have gotten any stranger. They'd wiped his memory and put him inside a gigantic maze. It was all so crazy, it really did seem funny. His heart skipped a beat when a boy unexpectedly appeared around a corner up ahead, entering the main passage from one of the offshoots to the right, running toward him and the glade. Covered in sweat, his face red, clothes sticking to his body, the boy didn't slow, hardly glancing at Thomas as he went past. He headed straight for the squat concrete building located near the box. Thomas turned as he passed, his eyes riveted to the exhausted runner, unsure why this new development surprised him so much. Why wouldn't people go out and search the maze? Then he realized others were entering through the remaining 3 glade openings, all of them running and looking as ragged as the guy who just whisked by him. There couldn't be much good about the maze if these guys came back looking so weary and worn. He watched, curious, as they met at the big iron door of the small building. One of the boys turned the rusty handle, grunting with the effort. Chuck had said something about runners earlier. What had they been doing out there? The big door finally popped open, and with a deafening squeal of metal against metal, the boys swung it wide. They disappeared inside, pulling it shut behind them with a loud clunk. Thomas stared, his mind churning to come up with any possible explanation for what he'd just witnessed. Nothing developed, but something about that creepy old building gave him goosebumps, a disquieting chill. Someone tugged on his sleeve, breaking him from his thoughts. Chuck had come back. Before Thomas had a chance to think, questions were rushing out of his mouth. Who are those guys, and what are they doing? What's in that building? He wheeled around and pointed out the east door. And why do you live inside a freaking maze? He felt a rattling pressure of uncertainty, making his head splinter with pain. I'm not saying another word, Chuck replied, a new authority filling his voice. I think you should get to bed early. You'll need your sleep. He stopped, held up a finger, pricking up his right ear. It's about to happen. What? Thomas asked, thinking it was kind of strange that Chuck was suddenly acting like an adult instead of the little kid desperate for a friend he'd been only moments earlier. A loud boom exploded through the air, making Thomas jump. It was followed by a horrible crunching, grinding sound. He stumbled backward, fell to the ground. It felt as if the whole earth shook. He looked around, panicked. The walls were closing. The walls were really closing, trapping him inside the glade. An onrushing sense of claustrophobia stifled him, compressed his lungs, as if water filled their cavities. "Calm down, Greenie," Chuck yelled over the noise. "It's just the walls." Thomas barely heard him, too fascinated, too shaken by the closing of the doors. He scrambled to his feet and took a few trembling steps back for a better view, finding it hard to believe what his eyes were seeing. The enormous stone wall to the right of them seemed to defy every known law of physics as it slid along the ground, throwing sparks and dust as it moved, rock against rock. The crunching sound rattled his bones. Thomas realized that only that wall was moving, heading for its neighbor to the left, ready to seal shut with its protruding rods slipping into the drilled holes across from it. He looked around at the other openings. It felt like his head was spinning faster than his body, and his stomach flipped over with dizziness. On all four sides of the glade, only the right walls were moving, toward the left, closing the gap of the doors. Impossible, he thought. How can they do that? He fought the urge to run out there, slip past the moving slabs of rock before they shut, flee the glade. Common sense won out. The maze held even more unknowns than his situation inside. He tried to picture in his mind how the structure of it all worked. Massive stone walls, hundreds of feet high, moving like sliding glass doors, an image from his past life that flashed through his thoughts. He tried to grasp the memory, hold on to it, complete the picture with faces, names, a place, but it faded into obscurity. A pang of sadness prickled through his other swirling emotions. He watched as the right wall reached the end of its journey, its connecting rods finding their mark and entering without a glitch. An echoing boom rumbled across the glade as all four doors sealed shut for the night. Thomas felt one final moment of trepidation, a quick slice of fear through his body, and then it vanished. A surprising sense of calm eased his nerves. He let out a long sigh of relief. "Wow," he said, feeling dumb at such a monumental understatement. "Ain't nothing, as Albie would say," Chuck murmured. "You kind of get used to it after a while." Thomas looked around one more time, the feel of the place completely different now, with all that the walls were solid with no way out. He tried to imagine the purpose of such a thing, and he didn't know which guess was worse, that they were being sealed in, or that they were being protected from something out there. The thought ended his brief moment of calm, stirring in his mind a million possibilities of what might live in the maze outside, all of them terrifying. Fear gripped him once again. "Come on," Chuck said, pulling at Thomas's sleeve a second time. "Trust me, when nighttime strikes, you want to be in bed." Thomas knew he had no other choice. He did his best to suppress everything he was feeling, and followed. Chapter 5. They ended up near the back of the homestead. That was what Chuck called the leaning structure of wood and windows, in a dark shadow between the building and the stone wall behind it. "Where are we going?" Thomas asked, still feeling the weight of seeing those walls close, thinking about the maze, the confusion, the fear. He told himself to stop or he'd drive himself crazy. Trying to grasp a sense of normalcy, he made a weak attempt at a joke. "If you're looking for a good night kiss, forget it." Chuck didn't miss a beat. "Just shut up and stay close." Thomas let out a big breath and shrugged before following the younger boy along the back of the building. They tiptoed until they came upon a small, dusty window, a soft beam of light shining through onto the stone and ivy. Thomas heard someone moving around inside. "The bathroom," Chuck whispered. "So?" A thread of unease stitched along Thomas's skin. "I love doing this to people. Gives me great pleasure before bedtime." "Doing what?" Something told Thomas Chuck was up to no good. "Maybe I should—" "Just shut your mouth and watch." Chuck quietly stepped up onto the big wooden box that sat right under the window. He crouched so that his head was positioned just below where the person on the inside would be able to see him. Then he reached up with his hand and lightly tapped on the glass. "This is stupid," Thomas whispered. "There couldn't possibly be a worse time to play a joke. Newt or Albie could be in there. I don't want to get in trouble. I just got here." Chuck suppressed a laugh by putting his hand over his mouth. Ignoring Thomas, he reached up and tapped the window again. A shadow crossed the light. Then the window slid open. Thomas jumped to hide, pressing himself against the back of the building as hard as he could. He just couldn't believe he'd been suckered into playing a practical joke on somebody. The angle of vision from the window protected him for the moment, but he knew he and Chuck would be seen if whoever was in there pushed his head outside to get a better look. "Who's that?" yelled the boy from the bathroom, his voice scratchy and laced with anger. Thomas had to hold in a gasp when he realized it was Golly. He knew that voice already. Without warning, Chuck suddenly popped his head up toward the window and screamed at the top of his lungs. A loud crash from inside revealed that the trick had worked, and a litany of swear words following it let them know Golly was none too happy about it. Thomas was struck with an odd mix of horror and embarrassment. "I'm gonna kill you, shuckface!" Golly yelled. But Chuck was already off the box and running toward the open glade. Thomas froze as he heard Golly open the door inside and run out of the bathroom. Thomas finally snapped out of his daze and took off after his new, and only, friend. He just rounded the corner when Golly came screaming out of the homestead, looking like a ferocious beast on the loose. He suddenly pointed at Thomas. "Come here!" he yelled. Thomas's heart sank in surrender. Everything seemed to indicate that he'd be getting a fist in the face. "It wasn't me, I swear," he said. Though, as he stood there, he sized the boy up and realized he shouldn't be so terrified after all. Golly wasn't that big. Thomas could actually take him if he had to. "Wasn't you?" Golly snarled. He ambled up to Thomas slowly and stopped right in front of him. "Then how do you know there was something you didn't do?" Thomas didn't say anything. He was definitely uncomfortable, but not nearly as scared as a few moments earlier. "I'm not a dong, Greenie," Golly spat. "I saw Chuck's fat face in the window." He pointed again, this time right at Thomas's chest. "But you better decide right quick who you want your friends and enemies. You hear me? One more trick like that, I don't care if it's your sissy idea or not, there'll be blood spilled. You got that, newbie?" But before Thomas could answer, Golly had already turned to walk away. Thomas just wanted this episode over. "Sorry," he muttered, wincing at how stupid it sounded. "I know you," Golly added without looking back. "I saw you in the changing. Now I'm going to figure out who you are." Thomas watched as the bully disappeared back into the homestead. He couldn't remember much, but something told him he'd never disliked someone so strongly. He was surprised by how much he truly hated the guy. He really, really hated him. He turned to see Chuck standing there, staring at the ground, clearly embarrassed. "Thanks a lot, buddy." "Sorry. If I'd known it was Golly, I never would have done it, I swear." Surprising himself, Thomas laughed. An hour ago, he thought he'd never hear such a sound come out of his mouth again. Chuck looked closely at Thomas and slowly broke into an uneasy grin. "What?" Thomas shook his head. "Don't be sorry. The shank deserved it. And I don't even know what a shank is. That was awesome." He felt much better. A couple of hours later, Thomas was lying on a soft sleeping bag next to Chuck on a bed of grass near the gardens. It was a wide lawn that he hadn't quite noticed before, and quite a few of the group chose it as their bedtime spot. Thomas thought that was strange, but apparently there wasn't enough room inside the homestead. At least it was warm, which made him wonder for the millionth time where they were. His mind had a hard time grasping names of places or remembering countries or rulers, how the world was organized. And none of the kids in the Glade had a clue either. At least, they weren't sharing it if they did. He lay in silence for the longest time, looking at the stars and listening to the soft murmurs of various conversations drifting across the Glade. Sleep felt miles away, and he couldn't shake the despair and hopelessness that coursed through his body and mind. The temporary joy of Chuck's trick on Golly had long since faded away. It had been one endless and strange day. It was just so weird. He remembered lots of little things about life: eating, clothes, studying, playing, general images of the makeup of the world, but any detail that would fill in the picture to create a true and complete memory had been erased somehow. It was like looking at an image through a foot of muddy water. More than anything else, perhaps, he felt sad. Chuck interrupted his thoughts. "Well, Greenie, you survived first day." "Barely." "Not now, Chuck," he wanted to say. I'm not in the mood. Chuck pulled himself up to lean on an elbow, looking at Thomas. You'll learn a lot in the next couple of days. Start getting used to things. Good that? Yeah, good that, I guess. Where'd all these weird words and phrases come from anyway? It seemed like they'd taken some other language and melded it with his own. Chuck flopped back down with a heavy flump. I don't know. I've only been here a month, remember? Thomas wondered about Chuck, whether he knew more than he let on. He was a quirky kid, funny, and he seemed innocent, but who was to say? Really, he was just as mysterious as everything else in the Glade. A few minutes passed, and Thomas felt the long day finally catch up to him, the leaded edge of sleep crossing over his mind. But like a fist had shoved it in his brain and let go, a thought popped into his head, one that he didn't expect, and that he wasn't sure where it came from. Suddenly, the Glade, the walls, the maze, it all seemed familiar, comfortable. A warmth of calmness spread through his chest, and for the first time since he'd found himself there, he didn't feel like the Glade was the worst place in the universe. He stilled, felt his eyes widen, his breathing stop for a long moment. What just happened, he thought. What changed? Ironically, the feeling that things would be okay made him slightly uneasy. Not quite understanding how, he knew what he needed to do. He didn't get it. The feeling, the epiphany, was a strange one, foreign and familiar at the same time, but it felt right. I want to be one of those guys that goes out there, he said aloud, not knowing if Chuck was still awake. Inside the maze. Huh? Was the response from Chuck. Thomas could hear a tinge of innocence in his voice. Runners, Thomas said, wishing he knew where this was coming from. Whatever they're doing out there, I want in. You don't even know what you're talking about, Chuck grumbled and rolled over. Go to sleep. Thomas felt a new surge of confidence, even though he truly didn't know what he was talking about. I want to be a runner. Chuck turned back and got up on his elbow. You can forget that little thought for right now. Thomas wondered at Chuck's reaction, but pressed on. Don't try to... Thomas, newbie, my friend, forget it. I'll tell Albie tomorrow. A runner, Thomas thought. I don't even know what that means. Have I gone completely insane? Chuck lay down with a laugh. You're a piece of clunk. Go to sleep. But Thomas couldn't quit. Something out there. It feels familiar. Go to sleep. Then it hit Thomas. He felt like several pieces of a puzzle had been put together. He didn't know what the ultimate picture would be, but his next words almost felt like they were coming from somewhere else. Chuck, I think I've been here before. He heard his friend sit up, heard the intake of breath, but Thomas rolled over and refused to say another word, worried he'd mess up this new sense of being encouraged, eradicate the reassuring calm that filled his heart. Sleep came much more easily than he'd expected. Chapter 6. Someone shook Thomas awake. His eyes snapped open to see a too-close face staring down at him, everything around them still shadowed by the darkness of early morning. He opened his mouth to speak, but a cold hand clamped down on it, gripping it shut. Panic flared until he saw who it was. Shh, Greenie. Don't want to be waking Chucky now, do we? It was Newt, the guy who seemed to be second in command. The air reeked of his morning breath. Though Thomas was surprised, any alarm melted away immediately. He couldn't help being curious, wondering what this boy wanted with him. Thomas nodded, doing his best to say yes with his eyes, until Newt finally took his hand away, then leaned back on his heels. Come on, Greenie, the tall boy whispered as he stood. He reached down and helped Thomas to his feet. He was so strong it felt like he could rip Thomas's arm off. Supposed to show you something before the wake-up. Any lingering haze of sleep had already vanished from Thomas's mind. Okay, he said simply, ready to follow. He knew he should hold some suspicion, having no reason to trust anyone yet, but the curiosity won out. He quickly leaned over and slipped on his shoes. Where are we going? Just follow me, and stay close. They snuck their way through the tightly strewn pack of sleeping bodies, Thomas almost tripping several times. He stepped on someone's hand, earned a sharp cry of pain in return, then a punch in the calf. "Sorry," he whispered, ignoring a dirty look from Newt. Once they left the lawn area and stepped onto the gray hard stone of the courtyard floor, Newt broke into a run, heading for the western wall. Thomas hesitated at first, wondering why he needed to run, but snapped out of it quickly and followed at the same pace. The light was dim, but any obstructions loomed as darker shadows, and he was able to make his way quickly along. He stopped when Newt did, right next to the massive wall towering above them like a skyscraper, another random image that floated in the murky pool of his memory wipe. Thomas noticed several small lights flashing here and there along the wall's face, moving about, stopping, turning off and on. "What are those?" he whispered as loudly as he dared, wondering if his voice sounded as shaky as he felt. A twinkling red glow of lights held an undercurrent of warning. Newt stood just a couple of feet in front of the thick curtain of ivy on the wall. "When you bloody need to know, you'll know, Greenie." "Well, it's kind of stupid to send me to a place where nothing makes sense and not answer my questions." Thomas paused, surprised at himself. "Shank," he added, throwing all the sarcasm he could into the syllable. Newt broke out in a laugh, but quickly cut it off. "I like you, Greenie. Now shut it, and let me show you something." Thomas stepped forward and dug his hands into the thick ivy, spreading several vines away from the wall to reveal a dust-frosted window, a square about 2 feet wide. It was dark at the moment, as if it had been painted black. "What are we looking for?" Thomas whispered. "Hold your undies, boy. One'll be coming along soon enough." A minute passed, then 2, several more. Thomas fidgeted on his feet, wondering how Newt could stand there, perfectly patient and still, staring into nothing but darkness. Then it changed. Glimmers of an eerie light shone through the window. It cast a wavering spectrum of colors on Newt's body and face, as if he stood next to a lighted swimming pool. Thomas grew perfectly still, squinting, trying to make out what it was on the other side. A thick lump grew in his throat. "What is that?" he thought. "Out there's the maze," Newt whispered, eyes wide as if in a trance. "Everything we do, our whole life, Greenie, revolves around the maze. Every loving second of every loving day we spend in honor of the maze, trying to solve something that's not shown us it has a bloody solution, you know? And we want to show you why it's not to be messed with. Show you why them buggin' walls close shut tight every night. Show you why you should never, never find your butt out there." Newt stepped back, still holding on to the ivy vines. He gestured for Thomas to take his place and look through the window. Thomas did, leaning forward until his nose touched the cool surface of the glass. It took a second for his eyes to focus on the moving object on the other side, to look past the grime and dust and see what Newt wanted him to see. And when he did, he felt his breath catch in his throat, like an icy wind had blown down there and frozen the air solid. A large, bulbous creature, the size of a cow, but with no distinct shape, twisted and seethed along the ground in the corridor outside. It climbed the opposite wall, then leaped at the thick glassed window with a loud thump. Thomas shrieked before he could stop himself, jerked away from the window, but the thing bounced backward, leaving the glass undamaged. Thomas sucked in 2 huge breaths and leaned in once more. It was too dark to make out clearly, but odd lights flashed out from an unknown source, revealing blurs of silver spikes and glistening flesh. Wicked instrument-tipped appendages protruded from its body like arms. A saw blade, a set of shears, long rods whose purpose could only be guessed. The creature was a horrific mix of animal and machine and seemed to realize it was being observed, seemed to know what lay inside the walls of the glade, seemed to want to get inside and feast on human flesh. Thomas felt an icy terror blossom in his chest, expand like a tumor, making it hard to breathe. Even with the memory wipe, he'd felt sure he'd never seen something so truly awful. He stepped back, the courage he'd felt the previous evening melting away. "What is that thing?" he asked. Something shivered in his gut, and he wondered if he'd ever be able to eat again. "Grievers, we call 'em," Newt answered. "Nasty bugger, eh? Just be glad the grievers only come out at night. Be thankful of these walls. Thomas swallowed, wondering how he could ever get out there. His desire to become a runner had taken a major blow, but he had to do it. Somehow, he knew he had to do it. It was such an odd thing to feel, especially after what he'd just seen. Newt looked at the window absently. Now you know what bloody lurks in the maze, my friend. Now you know this isn't a joke time. You've been sent to the Glade, Greenie, and we'll be expecting you to survive and help us do what we've been sent here to do." "And what's that?" Thomas asked, even though he was terrified to hear the answer. Newt turned to look at him dead in the eye. The first traces of dawn had crept up on them, and Thomas could see every detail of Newt's face, his skin tight, his brow creased. "Find your way out, Greenie," Newt said. "Solve the buggin' maze and find your way home." A couple hours later, the doors having reopened, rumbling and grumbling and shaking the ground until they were finished, Thomas sat at a worn, tilted picnic table outside the homestead. All he could think about was the grievers, what their purpose could be, what they did out there during the night. What would it be like to be attacked by something so terrible? He tried to get the image out of his head, move on to something else. The runners, they'd just left without saying a word to anybody, bolting into the maze at full speed and disappearing around corners. He pictured them in his mind and picked at his eggs and bacon with a fork, speaking to no one, not even Chuck, who ate silently next to him. Poor guy had exhausted himself, trying to start a conversation with Thomas, who'd refused to respond. All he wanted was to be left alone. He just didn't get it. His brain was on overload, trying to compute the sheer impossibility of the situation. How could a maze, with walls so massive and tall, be so big that dozens of kids hadn't been able to solve it after who knew how long trying? How could such a structure exist? And more importantly, why? What could possibly be the purpose of such a thing? Why were they all there? How long had they been there? Try as he might to avoid it, his mind still kept wandering back to the image of the vicious griever. Its phantom brother seemed to leap at him every time he blinked or rubbed his eyes. Thomas knew he was a smart kid. He somehow felt it in his bones. But nothing about this place made any sense, except for one thing. He was supposed to be a runner. Why did he feel that so strongly? And even now, after seeing what lived in the maze? A tap on his shoulder jarred him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Albie standing behind him, arms folded. "Ain't you looking fresh?" Albie said. "Get a nice view out the window this morning?" Thomas stood, hoping the time for answers had come, or maybe hoping for a distraction from his gloomy thoughts. "Enough to make me want to learn about this place," he said, hoping to avoid provoking the temper he'd seen flare in this guy the day before. Albie nodded. "Me and you, Shank. The tour begins now." He started to move, but then stopped, holding up a finger. "Ain't no questions till the end. You get me? Ain't got no time to jaw with you all day." "But—" Thomas stopped when Albie's eyebrows shot up. Why did the guy have to be such a jerk? "But tell me everything. I want to know everything." He decided the night before not to tell anyone else how strangely familiar the place seemed, the odd feeling that he'd been there before, that he could remember things about it. Sharing that seemed like a very bad idea. "I'll tell you what I want to tell you, Greenie. Let's go." "Can I come?" Chuck asked from the table. Albie reached down and tweaked the boy's ear. "Ow!" Chuck shrieked. "Ain't you got a job, slinthead?" Albie asked. "Lots of slopping to do?" Chuck rolled his eyes, then looked at Thomas. "Have fun." "I'll try." He suddenly felt sorry for Chuck, wished people would treat the kid better. But there was nothing he could do about it. It was time to go. He walked away with Albie, hoping the tour had officially begun. Chapter 7. They started at the box, which was closed at the moment, double doors of metal lying flat on the ground, covered in white paint, faded and cracked. The day had brightened considerably, the shadows stretching in the opposite direction from what Thomas had seen yesterday. He still hadn't spotted the sun, but it looked like it was about to pop over the eastern wall at any minute. Albie pointed down at the doors. "This here's the box. Once a month, we get a newbie like you. Never fails. Once a week, we get supplies, clothes, some food. Ain't needing a lot, pretty much run ourselves in the Glade. Thomas nodded, his whole body itching with the desire to ask questions. I need to put some tape right over my mouth, he thought. We don't know jack about the box, you get me? Albie continued. Where it came from, how it gets here, who's in charge. The Shanks that sent us here ain't told us nothing. We got all the electricity we need, grow and raise most of our food, get clothes and such. Tried to send a slint-head greenie back in the box one time. Thing wouldn't move till we took him out. Thomas wondered what lay under the doors when the box wasn't there, but he held his tongue. He felt such a mixture of emotions, curiosity, frustration, wonder, all laced with the lingering horror of seeing the griever that morning. Albie kept talking, never bothering to look Thomas in the eye. Glade's cut into 4 sections. He held up his fingers as he counted off the next 4 words. Gardens, Bloodhouse, Homestead, Deadheads. You got that? Thomas hesitated, then shook his head, confused. Albie's eyelids fluttered briefly as he continued. He looked like he could think of 1,000 things he'd rather be doing right then. He pointed to the northeast corner, where the fields and fruit trees were located. Gardens, where we grow the crops. Water's pumped in through pipes in the ground. Always has been, or we'd be starved to death a long time ago. Never rains here. Never. He pointed to the southeast corner, at the animal pens and the barn. Bloodhouse, where we raise and slaughter animals. He pointed at the pitiful living quarters. Homestead. Stupid place is twice as big than when the first of us got here because we keep getting added to it, and they send us wood and clunk. Ain't pretty, but it works. Most of us sleep outside anyway. Thomas felt dizzy. So many questions splintered his mind he couldn't keep them straight. Albie pointed to the southwest corner, the forest area, fronted with several sickly trees and benches. Call that the Deadheads. Graveyards back in that corner, and in the thicker woods. Ain't much else. You can go there to sit and rest, hang out, whatever. He cleared his throat, as if wanting to change subjects. You'll spend the next 2 weeks working 1 day apiece for our different job keepers, until we know what you're best at. Slopper, bricknick, bagger, track hoe. Something'll stick. Always does. Come on. Albie walked toward the south door, located between what he'd called the Deadheads and the Bloodhouse. Thomas followed, wrinkling his nose up at the sudden smell of dirt and manure coming from the animal pens. Graveyard? He thought. Why do they need a graveyard in a place full of teenagers? That disturbed him even more than not knowing some of the words Albie kept saying, words like slopper and bagger, that didn't sound so good. He came as close to interrupting Albie as he'd done so far, but willed his mouth shut. Frustrated, he turned his attention to the pens in the Bloodhouse area. Several cows nibbled and chewed at a trough full of greenish hay. Pigs lounged in a muddy pit, an occasionally flickering tail, the only sign that they were alive. Another pen held sheep, and there were chicken coops and turkey cages as well. Workers bustled about the area, looking as if they had spent their whole lives on a farm. Why do I remember these animals? Thomas wondered. Nothing about them seemed new or interesting. He knew what they were called, what they normally ate, what they looked like. Why was stuff like that still lodged in his memory, but not where he'd seen animals before, or with whom? His memory loss was baffling in its complexity. Albie pointed to a large barn in the back corner, its red paint long faded to a dull rust color. Back there's where the slicers work. Nasty stuff, that. Nasty. If you like blood, you can be a slicer. Tom shook his head. Slicer didn't sound good at all. As they kept walking, he focused his attention on the other side of the glade, the section Albie had called the Deadheads. The trees grew thicker and denser the farther back in the corner they went, more alive and full of leaves. Dark shadows filled the depths of the wooded area, despite the time of day. Thomas looked up, squinting to see that the sun was finally visible, though it looked odd, more orange than it should be. It hit him that this was yet another example of the odd selective memory in his mind. He returned his gaze to the Deadheads, a glowing disk still floating in his vision. Blinking to clear it away, he suddenly caught the red lights again, flickering and skittering about deep in the woods. darkness of the woods. What are those things, he wondered, irritated that Newt hadn't answered him earlier. The secrecy was very annoying. Albie stopped walking, and Thomas was surprised to see they had reached the south door. The two walls bracketing the exit towered above them. The thick slabs of gray stone were cracked and covered in ivy, as ancient as anything Thomas could imagine. He craned his neck to see the top of the walls far above. His mind spun with the odd sensation that he was looking down, not up. He staggered back a step, awed again by the structure of his new home, then finally returned his attention to Albie, who had his back to the exit. "Out there's the maze." Albie jabbed a thumb over his shoulder, then paused. Thomas stared in that direction, through the gap in the walls that served as an exit from the glade. The corridors out there looked much the same as the ones he'd seen from the window by the east door early that morning. This thought gave him a chill, made him wonder if a griever might come charging toward them at any minute. He took a step backward before realizing what he was doing. "Calm down," he chided himself, embarrassed. Albie continued. 2 years I've been here. Ain't none been here longer. The few before me are already dead." Thomas felt his eyes widen, his heart quicken. 2 years we've tried to solve this thing. No luck. Shuckin' walls move out there at night just as much as these here doors. Mapping it out ain't easy. Ain't easy nohow. He nodded toward the concrete blocked building into which the runners had disappeared the night before. Another stab of pain sliced through Thomas's head. There were too many things to compute at once. They'd been here 2 years? The walls moved out and the maze? How many had died? He stepped forward, wanting to see the maze for himself, as if the answers were printed on the walls out there. Albie held out a hand and pushed Thomas in the chest, sent him stumbling backward. "Ain't no going out there, Shank." Thomas had to suppress his pride. "Why not?" "You think I sent Newt to you before the wake-up just for kicks? Freak, that's the #1 rule. The only one you'll never be forgiven for breaking. Ain't nobody allowed in the maze except the runners. Break that rule, and if you ain't killed by the grievers, we'll kill you ourselves, you got me?" Thomas nodded, grumbling inside, sure that Albie was exaggerating, hoping that he was. Either way, if he'd had any doubt about what he'd told Chuck the night before, it had now completely vanished. He wanted to be a runner. He would be a runner. Deep inside, he knew he had to go out there, into the maze. Despite everything he'd learned and witnessed firsthand, it called to him as much as hunger or thirst. A movement up on the left wall of the south door caught his attention. Startled, he reacted quickly, looking just in time to see a flash of silver. A patch of ivy shook as the thing disappeared into it. Thomas pointed up at the wall. "What was that?" he asked, before he could be shut down again. Albie didn't bother looking. "No questions till the end, Shank. How many times I gotta tell you?" He paused, then let out a sigh. "Beetle blades. It's how the creators watch us. You better not." He was cut off by a booming, ringing alarm that sounded from all directions. Thomas clamped his hands up to his ears, looking around as the siren blared, his heart about to thump its way out of his chest. But when he focused back on Albie, he stopped. Albie wasn't acting scared. He appeared confused, surprised. The alarm clanged through the air. "What's going on?" Thomas asked. Relief flooded his chest that his tour guide didn't seem to think the world was about to end. But even so, Thomas was getting tired of being hit by waves of panic. "That's weird," was all Albie said as he scanned the glade, squinting. Thomas noticed people in the bloodhouse pens glancing around, apparently just as confused. One shouted to Albie, a short, skinny kid drenched in mud. "What's up with that?" the boy asked, looking to Thomas for some reason. "I don't know," Albie murmured back in a distant voice. But Thomas couldn't stand it anymore. "Albie, what's going on?" "The box, shuckface, the box," was all Albie said before he set off for the middle of the glade at a brisk pace that almost looked to Thomas like panic. "What about it?" Thomas demanded, hurrying to catch up. "Talk to me," he wanted to scream at him. But Albie didn't answer or slow down. and as they got closer to the box, Thomas could see that dozens of kids were running around the courtyard. He spotted Newt and called to him, trying to suppress his rising fear, telling himself things would be okay, that there had to be a reasonable explanation. "Newt, what's going on?" he yelled. Newt glanced over at him, then nodded and walked over, strangely calm in the middle of the chaos. He swatted Thomas on the back. "Means a bloody newbie's coming up in the box." He paused as if expecting Thomas to be impressed. "Right now." So? As Thomas looked more closely at Newt, he realized that what he'd mistaken for calm was actually disbelief, maybe even excitement. "So," Newt replied, his jaw dropping slightly, "Greenie, we've never had two newbies show up in the same month, much less 2 days in a row." And with that, he ran off toward the homestead.